There are some people in this world who believe money gives them the right to treat others like they are nothing. Reginald Thornwood was exactly that kind of man. At 63 years old, he owned one of the largest textile companies in the country. He had mansions, luxury cars, and more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. But the thing he loved most was making people feel small. It gave him a strange kind of pleasure to remind everyone around him that they were beneath him. His estate in Connecticut was massive. 27 rooms, gardens that stretched for acres, and a staff of 12 people who worked day and night to keep everything perfect. Among them was a woman named Lucia Delgado. Lucia had worked as the caretaker of the estate for 3 years. She cleaned the floors, tended the roses, polished the silver, and made sure every corner of the mansion sparkled. She was 41 years old, quiet, and kept to herself. Most of the other staff barely knew anything about her. She came early, worked hard, and left without making a sound. That was exactly how Reginald liked his workers. Invisible. He never learned their names. He never asked about their lives. To him, they were just hands that cleaned and faces that nodded. Nothing more. Lucia never complained. She did her job, collected her paycheck, and went home to her small apartment in the city. If anyone had asked her why she stayed in such a job, she would have simply shrugged and said it paid the bills. But there was something about Lucia that nobody knew. A secret she had buried so deep that even she tried to forget it most days. One autumn evening, everything changed. Reginald was hosting one of his famous dinner parties. He did this 4 or 5 times a year, inviting the richest and most powerful people in the city to his home. It was never really about friendship or connection. It was about showing off. He wanted people to see his wealth, admire his success, and envy his life. That night, over 40 guests filled his grand dining hall. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling. Waiters in white gloves carried trays of champagne. The smell of expensive perfume and roasted lamb filled the air. Reginald stood at the center of it all, laughing loudly at his own jokes, slapping his business partners on the back, and soaking up the admiration like a sponge. His daughter, Vivian, was there too. She was 30 years old, elegant but cold, very much her father's child. And then there was his son, Adrian. At 34, Adrian was the opposite of his father in almost every way. He was quiet, thoughtful, and often looked uncomfortable at these events. He hated the way his father treated people, but he had never found the courage to say it out loud. The highlight of the evening was supposed to be a performance by a famous concert pianist. Reginald had paid a fortune to fly him in from Vienna. It was meant to be the grand finale of the party, the moment everyone would talk about for weeks. But 30 minutes before the performance, disaster struck. The pianist called. His flight had been delayed due to a storm. He would not make it. Vivian was furious. She stormed around the room, snapping at the staff, demanding someone fix the situation. Reginald's face turned red with embarrassment. All these important people, and now there would be no show. He looked like a fool. That is when his eyes landed on Lucia. She was in the corner of the room, quietly dusting the grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument, a Steinway from 1923, worth more than most people's homes. Reginald had bought it at an auction years ago, not because he played, but because it looked impressive. A cruel smile spread across his face. He walked over to her, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble floor. The room grew quieter as people noticed. Lucia looked up, confused. In 3 years, Reginald had never once spoken directly to her. He stood in front of her, looking down like she was an insect. Then he said loudly, so everyone could hear, "You there, the cleaning woman. Do you even know what this thing is called?" A few guests chuckled. Lucia's heart pounded, but she kept her face calm. She answered quietly, "It is a Steinway, sir. A 1923 Model D concert grand." The laughter stopped. Reginald blinked. He had not expected that, but he recovered quickly, letting out a big, mocking laugh. "Well, look at that." She read the little label on the side. "How clever." More laughter from the crowd, but this time it felt forced. Reginald was enjoying himself now. He gestured dramatically toward the piano. "Tell you what, cleaning lady. Since our pianist is not coming, why don't you entertain us? Sit down and play something. Anything at all." Lucia stared at him. "Sir, I do not think that is—" He cut her off. "Come on. Do not be shy. I will make it worth your while." He looked around at his guests with a grin. "If you can get through one song without completely embarrassing yourself, I will double your salary for the year." Some guests gasped. Others laughed nervously. This was cruel, and everyone knew it. But nobody said anything. That was the power Reginald had over people. Then he added something even worse. "And if you play it beautifully," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "I mean really beautifully. Like a true artist." He paused for effect, glancing at his son. "Then I will let you marry my son." The room erupted in laughter. Adrian stepped forward, his face tight with anger. "Father, stop this. It is not funny." Reginald waved him away like he was swatting a fly. "Quiet, boy. This is entertainment." He turned back to Lucia. "Well, what do you say? Are you going to stand there all night? Or are you going to show us what the help can do?" Lucia felt the eyes of every person in that room burning into her. She saw the smirks on their faces. She heard the whispers. They all expected her to fail. They wanted her to fail. It would give them a story to laugh about at their next party. Her hands were trembling. Her throat was dry. She could have walked away. She could have apologized, bowed her head, and disappeared back into the shadows where she had lived for so long. But something inside her snapped. Maybe it was the years of silence. Maybe it was the way Reginald looked at her, like she was less than human. Maybe it was the memory of her father's voice, telling her never to let anyone steal her music. Whatever it was, Lucia made a decision. She set down her cleaning cloth. She walked slowly toward the piano. And she sat down on the bench. The room went completely silent. Reginald crossed his arms, a smug smile on his face. He could not wait to see her humiliate herself. Lucia placed her fingers on the keys. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath, and then she began to play. The first notes floated into the air like a whisper. They were soft, almost hesitant, as if Lucia herself could not believe what she was doing. Her fingers touched the keys gently, feeling their familiar weight after so many years. A few guests shifted in their seats. Some exchanged glances, waiting for the disaster they were sure would come. Reginald stood with his arms crossed, that cruel smile still fixed on his face. But then, something changed. The music grew stronger. The hesitation disappeared. Lucia's fingers began to move with a confidence that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, a place she had locked away for over a decade. She was playing Chopin, the Ballade No. 1 in G minor. It is one of the most difficult and emotional pieces ever written for piano. Professional musicians spend years trying to master it. Many never do, and here was this cleaning woman, playing it like she had been born for this moment. The first person to react was Vivian. Her champagne glass stopped halfway to her lips. Her eyes went wide. She knew music. She had taken piano lessons her entire childhood, and she recognized immediately that what she was hearing was not ordinary. This was something extraordinary. One by one, the guests fell silent. Conversations died. Laughter faded. Even the waiters stopped moving. Frozen in place with their silver trays, the music filled every corner of that massive room. It rose and fell like waves on the ocean. It whispered, then roared, then whispered again. There was pain in those notes. There was longing. There was a sadness so deep it made your chest ache just to hear it. Lucia played with her eyes closed. She was not in that dining room anymore. She was somewhere else entirely. She was back in a tiny apartment in Buenos Aires, sitting next to her father on a worn-out piano bench. She could smell his coffee. She could hear his voice guiding her, telling her to feel the music, not just play it. She was 7 years old again, performing in her first recital. her small hands shaking with nerves while her father watched from the front row with tears of pride in his eyes. She was 17, receiving the letter that changed her life, the scholarship to one of the best music schools in the world. She was 20, standing on stage in a sold-out concert hall. The youngest first-chair pianist the Buenos Aires Philharmonic had ever seen. And then she was 21, standing in the ashes of everything she had ever loved. The music shifted. It became darker, heavier. The pain in those notes was no longer hidden. It poured out like a river breaking through a dam. Some of the guests looked away, uncomfortable. Others leaned forward, completely hypnotized. Adrian could not take his eyes off her. He had never seen anything like this. He had never felt anything like this. The woman he had walked past 100 times without noticing was creating something so beautiful it almost hurt to witness. Even Reginald's smile had faded. His arms dropped to his sides. His face had gone pale. He did not understand what was happening, but he understood enough to know that he had made a terrible mistake. The piece built toward its climax. Lucia's fingers flew across the keys with impossible speed and precision. The music swelled, filling the room, pressing against the walls, demanding to be heard. And then, with one final, devastating chord, it was over. Silence. For a long moment, nobody moved, nobody breathed. Then Vivian began to cry. She did not even try to hide it. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the woman sitting at the piano. An older woman near the back started clapping. Then another guest joined in. Then another. Within seconds, the entire room erupted in applause. Not polite applause, not the kind you give out of obligation. This was something real. People were on their feet, clapping so hard their hands hurt, shouting words like incredible and magnificent. But Lucia did not smile. She opened her eyes slowly, as if waking from a dream. She looked out at the crowd of wealthy faces, the same people who had laughed at her just minutes ago. She saw their tears, their amazement, their disbelief, and she felt nothing. She stood up from the bench. The applause continued, but she did not acknowledge it. She smoothed down her simple work uniform, the same one she wore every day to scrub floors and polish silver. Then she turned and looked directly at Reginald. He stood frozen, his face a mixture of shock and something else. Fear, maybe. Or shame. It was hard to tell with a man like him. Lucia walked toward him. The applause slowly faded as people realized something was happening. The room grew quiet again. She stopped just a few feet away from him. When she spoke, her voice was calm and steady, but there was a fire behind her words that made everyone listen. "My father," she said, "was Maestro Roberto Delgado." A gasp rippled through the crowd. Several of the older guests exchanged stunned looks. That name meant something to them. Lucia continued. He trained under the great Artur Rubinstein. He performed in concert halls across Europe and South America. He dedicated his life to music, and he dedicated his life to teaching me. She paused, letting the words sink in. I was the youngest pianist ever accepted to the National Conservatory in Buenos Aires. I received a full scholarship to Juilliard when I was 17. By the time I was 20, I was first chair of the Buenos Aires Philharmonic. The room was completely silent now. Even the staff had stopped pretending to work. Everyone was staring at Lucia, trying to understand how this was possible. How could this woman, this cleaning lady, be who she was claiming to be? Reginald opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Lucia was not finished. My father died in a fire when I was 21, she said. Her voice wavered slightly. But she did not look away. I lost everything that night. My home, my sheet music, every recording, every photograph, every memory I could hold in my hands, and I lost him. She took a breath. After that, I could not play anymore. The music was connected to him, and losing him broke something inside me. So I stopped. I walked away from everything. I came to this country with nothing and started over. I took jobs no one else wanted. I became invisible. Because invisible felt safe. She looked around the room one more time, at all the wealthy faces staring back at her. Tonight was the first time I have touched a piano in 12 years. The silence that followed was deafening. Nobody knew what to say. Nobody knew what to do. Vivian wiped her eyes. Her expression completely changed. Several guests looked at Reginald with something new in their eyes. Disgust. Maybe. Or disappointment. Adrian stepped forward, wanting to say something, wanting to reach out to her. But before he could speak, Lucia turned and walked toward the door. She did not run. She did not hurry. She walked with her head held high, with a dignity that no amount of money could buy. As she reached the doorway, she paused. Without turning around, she said one last thing. "You asked me to play, Mr. Thornwood. I played. Now we are done." And then she was gone. The room remained frozen for a long moment. Then, slowly, the whispers began. People leaned toward each other, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Who was this woman? How had she ended up here? And what kind of man humiliates someone like that for entertainment? Reginald stood alone in the middle of his own party, surrounded by people who suddenly looked at him very differently. Adrian did not wait for the whispers to stop. He set down his glass and walked out of the room, following the path Lucia had taken. He had to find her. Adrian found her in the garden, sitting on the old stone bench near the roses. The night air was cold, and she had no jacket. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, staring up at the sky. The moon was bright that night, casting silver light across the flowers she had planted herself 3 years ago. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. His shoes crunched softly on the gravel path. When he was a few feet away, he stopped. "May I sit down?" he asked quietly. Lucia did not look at him. For a moment, he thought she would say no. But then she gave a small nod, and he sat down on the other end of the bench, leaving space between them. They sat in silence for a while. The sounds of the party drifted faintly from the house. Laughter, clinking glasses, the murmur of conversation. It all felt very far away. Finally, Adrian spoke. "I am sorry." Lucia turned to look at him. "For what?" "For my father. For what he did in there. It was cruel, and it was wrong. And I should have stopped it before it even started." She studied his face for a moment. He looked genuinely pained. Nothing like the arrogant man who had mocked her in front of everyone. There was kindness in his eyes. She had noticed it before, on the rare occasions when their paths crossed in the house. He was always polite to the staff. He said please and thank you. Small things, but they mattered. "It is not your fault," she said. "You are not responsible for the choices he makes." "Maybe not. But I have watched him treat people this way my whole life, and I have never done anything about it. I just stood there, like everyone else." He shook his head. "That makes me part of the problem." Lucia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Most people stay quiet. It is easier that way. That does not make it right." She almost smiled. "Almost. No. It does not." Another silence fell between them, but this one felt different, more comfortable, like the beginning of something. Adrian turned to her. "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask. I might not answer." "Fair enough." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Why did you never say anything? In 3 years, you never told anyone who you were. You never mentioned your father, or your career, or any of it. Why?" Lucia looked back up at the stars. The question was simple, but the answer was not. "When my father died," she began slowly, "I thought I would die too. Not physically, but inside. He was everything to me. My teacher, my best friend, my whole world. Music was the language we shared. When I played, I felt like he was right there beside me." She paused, gathering herself. "After the fire, I could not touch a piano. Every time I tried, I heard his voice. I saw his face, and the pain was so strong that I could not breathe. So I stopped trying. I told myself it was temporary, that I just needed time to heal. But days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And eventually, I realized the music was gone. Adrian listened without interrupting. He could feel the weight of her words, the years of grief and silence she had carried alone. I left Argentina, she continued. I could not stay there. Everything reminded me of him. So I came here. To start over. I took whatever work I could find. Cleaning offices, washing dishes. Eventually, I ended up here. She gestured toward the mansion behind them. Your father does not see the people who work for him. To him, we are just hands, and backs, and bowed heads. And honestly, that was fine with me. I did not want to be seen. I wanted to disappear. Being invisible felt safe. Adrian's heart ached for her. He could not imagine losing someone that important and having to rebuild your entire life from nothing. But tonight, he said softly. You played. She nodded slowly. Tonight, something broke. Or maybe something finally healed. I do not know which. When your father looked at me like I was nothing, like I was less than human, something inside me refused to accept it. I thought of my father. I thought of everything he taught me. And I decided that I was done being invisible. She looked at him directly now, her eyes shining in the moonlight. That performance was not for your father. It was not for any of those people in there. It was for me. And it was for my father. After 12 years, I finally played for him again. Adrian did not know what to say. He had never met anyone like her. Here was a woman who had lost everything, who had been humiliated in front of a room full of strangers. And yet she sat here with more dignity and strength than anyone he had ever known. It was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard, he said honestly. And I have heard a lot of music in my life. But nothing like that. Nothing even close. Lucia looked down at her hands, the same hands that had scrubbed floors and polished silver for 3 years. The same hands that had once performed in concert halls across the world. Thank you, she said quietly. Inside the mansion, a very different conversation was happening. Reginald had retreated to his study, his face still pale from what had happened. His oldest friend and business partner, a man named Theodore Ashford, had followed him. Theodore closed the door behind them. Reginald, do you have any idea what you just did? Reginald poured himself a whiskey with shaking hands. I made a joke. It got out of hand. These things happen. A joke? Theodore stared at him in disbelief. Do you know who Roberto Delgado was? Some pianist. She mentioned him. Theodore walked closer, his voice dropping low. Roberto Delgado was not just some pianist. He was a legend. I saw him perform in Vienna 30 years ago, and I still remember every note. His recordings are worth a fortune. Collectors pay thousands for original pressings. Reginald took a long drink of his whiskey. So, the music world thought his daughter was dead. After the fire, she disappeared completely. Everyone assumed she died with him, or that she had given up entirely. But she is alive. Reginald. She is alive. And she has been working as a cleaning woman in your house for 3 years. The color drained even further from Reginald's face. Theodore continued. When word gets out about what happened tonight, and it will get out, you are going to have a very serious problem. You publicly humiliated the daughter of one of the greatest musicians of the 20th century. You made her a spectacle for your rich friends. How do you think that is going to look? Reginald set down his glass. His jaw tightened. No one needs to know. Half the people at your party are already talking about it. By tomorrow morning, this story will be everywhere. You embarrassed yourself tonight, old friend. And for once, I do not think your money is going to fix it. Theodore turned and walked toward the door. Before he left, he looked back one more time. If I were you, I would start thinking about how to make this right. Because if that woman decides to tell her story, you are finished. He walked out, leaving Reginald alone with his whiskey and his thoughts. Back in the garden, Adrian and Lucia were still sitting on the stone bench. The party noise had faded. Most of the guests were leaving. Whispering among themselves as they got into their expensive cars, Adrian turned to her. "What will you do now?" Lucia considered the question. For the first time in 12 years, she did not have an easy answer. The life she had built, the quiet, invisible life, was over. She could not go back to pretending. "I do not know," she admitted. "But I think, for the first time in a very long time, I am ready to find out." Adrian smiled. It was a warm smile, genuine and kind. "Whatever you decide," he said, "you do not have to figure it out alone." She looked at him. This man she barely knew, who had followed her into the cold night just to make sure she was okay. He was nothing like his father. Nothing at all. "Why do you care?" she asked. "You do not even know me." Adrian thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "Maybe not. But I would like to. If you will let me." The night stretched out around them, full of stars and silence, and the faint smell of roses. And for the first time in 12 years, Lucia did not feel alone. The next morning came gray and cold. Lucia had not slept much. She lay awake in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events of the night before. Her fingers still tingled from the memory of the piano keys. Her heart still ached from the memories she had unlocked. But underneath all of that, there was something new. Something she had not felt in a very long time. Hope. She got dressed and made her way to the estate, just like she did every morning. She did not know what to expect. Maybe Reginald would fire her. Maybe he would pretend nothing had happened. Either way, she was done hiding. Whatever came next, she would face it. When she arrived, the house was unusually quiet. The other staff members looked at her differently now. Some with curiosity, some with admiration. A few even nodded at her with something like respect. Word had spread. She went about her usual duties, dusting the shelves in the library, watering the plants in the sunroom. She was polishing a mirror in the hallway when she heard footsteps behind her. "Miss Delgado." She turned. It was one of the housekeepers, a young woman named Rosa. Her eyes were wide with worry. "Mr. Thornwood wants to see you, in his study. Right now." Lucia set down her cloth. She had expected this. She took a deep breath and walked toward the study. The door was heavy oak, dark and imposing. She knocked once. "Come in," said a voice from inside. She entered. Reginald sat behind his massive desk, surrounded by leather-bound books and expensive art. He looked older this morning. Somehow. Smaller. The arrogance was still there, but it was strained, like a mask that no longer fit properly. He gestured to the chair in front of his desk. "Sit." Lucia remained standing. "I prefer to stand, Mr. Thornwood." His jaw tightened, but he did not argue. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and studied her with cold eyes. "You caused quite a scene last night," he said. "I played the piano. You asked me to. I did not ask you to humiliate me in front of my guests." Lucia almost laughed. "Almost. With respect, sir. You humiliated yourself. I simply played music." Reginald's face flushed red. He was not used to being spoken to this way, especially not by someone he considered beneath him. But he forced himself to stay calm. He had a plan. He opened a drawer in his desk and pulled out a checkbook. He clicked his pen and began to write. "Let us skip the games," he said. "I am a businessman. I solve problems with money. And right now, you are a problem." He tore the check from the book and slid it across the desk toward her. Lucia looked down at it. The number written there was enormous. More money than she would earn in 20 years of cleaning houses. "Take it," Reginald said. "Take it and disappear. Leave this city. Go back to Argentina. Go wherever you want. But you do not speak to anyone about what happened here. You do not give interviews. You do not tell your story. You simply vanish." Lucia stared at the check for a long moment. She thought about what that money could mean. A new apartment. A fresh start. Security for the rest of her life. Then she looked up at Reginald. "No." The word hung in the air between them. Reginald blinked. "Excuse me?" I said no. Her voice was calm, steady. "I do not want your money." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Everyone wants money. Do not play games with me." "I am not playing games. I came to this country with nothing. I built a life with nothing. I do not need your money to survive. And I certainly do not need it badly enough to sell my silence." Reginald stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Do you understand who you are dealing with? I could destroy you. I could make sure you never work again. I could—" "You could what?" Lucia interrupted. She took a step closer to the desk. "Spread rumors about me? Tell people I am difficult? Go ahead. The truth is already out there. Mr. Thornwood, half your guests last night recorded my performance on their phones. By now, it is probably all over the internet." Reginald's face went pale. Lucia continued. "You cannot buy your way out of this. You cannot threaten your way out of it either. What happened last night happened, and the whole world is going to know that Reginald Thornwood, the great businessman, the man who loves to feel powerful, tried to humiliate a grieving woman for entertainment." She picked up the check from the desk. Slowly, deliberately, she tore it in half, then in half again. She let the pieces flutter to the floor. "I do not want your money," she said. "I want something you cannot give me. I want my dignity, and I already took that back last night." Reginald was shaking now. Whether from anger or fear, it was hard to tell. Before he could respond, the door opened behind them. Adrian walked in. He took one look at the scene. The torn check on the floor. His father's furious face. Lucia, standing tall and unbroken. And he understood immediately. "What is going on here?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Reginald pointed at Lucia. "This woman is trying to ruin me. She refuses to be reasonable." Adrian walked past his father and stood beside Lucia. "It looks to me like she is refusing to be bought." "There is a difference. Stay out of this, Adrian. This is business." "No, father. This is bullying. It is what you have always done. You use your money and your power to crush anyone who makes you uncomfortable. But it is not going to work this time." Reginald stared at his son like he was seeing him for the first time. "You would side with her? Over your own family?" Adrian did not hesitate. "I am siding with what is right. For once in my life, I am doing what I should have done years ago." He turned to Lucia. "You do not have to stay here. You do not have to listen to any more of this. Let me take you somewhere safe." Lucia looked at him. This man who had every reason to protect his family, his inheritance, his comfortable life. And yet here he was, standing beside her, choosing her over all of it. "Your father will never forgive you for this," she said quietly. "I know. You could lose everything." Adrian smiled, a sad but certain smile. "I have spent my whole life surrounded by everything. Money, houses, cars, things, but I have never had anything real, nothing that mattered." He looked into her eyes. "Maybe it is time I started." Reginald slammed his hand on the desk. "If you walk out that door with her, you are no longer my son. Do you understand me? I will cut you off completely. You will have nothing." Adrian turned to face his father one last time. "Then I will have nothing," he said. "And I will still have more than you ever did." He offered his hand to Lucia. She looked at it for a moment. This hand that was offering her something she had never expected to find again. Trust, partnership, a future. She took it. Together, they walked out of the study, out of the mansion, and into the cold morning light. Behind them, Reginald stood alone in his empire of expensive things. The silence around him was deafening. For the first time in his life, all his money and all his power meant absolutely nothing. He had lost, and he knew it. 6 months can change everything. Lucia learned this in ways she never could have imagined. The night she walked out of that mansion with Adrian, she had no idea what the future would hold. She only knew that the life she had been living was over, and something new was about to begin. The video from the dinner party spread across the internet within days. Someone had filmed her entire performance on their phone, and once it was online, it took on a life of its own. Millions of people watched this woman in a cleaning uniform sit down at a grand piano and play like an angel. The comments poured in from all over the world. People wanted to know who she was. They wanted to know her story. And slowly, piece by piece, the story came out. Journalists dug into her past. They found old recordings of her performances in Buenos Aires. They found interviews with musicians who remembered her father. They found photos of a young Lucia, barely 20 years old, standing on stage with a bouquet of flowers after a sold-out concert. The world fell in love with her, but they also learned about Reginald Thornwood. They learned how he had mocked her in front of his wealthy friends. They learned about the bet, the cruel laughter, the way he had tried to humiliate her for entertainment. And they did not forgive him. His business partners began to distance themselves. Investors pulled out of deals. His wife, who had tolerated his behavior for decades, finally filed for divorce. The newspapers called him a bully and a fraud. His empire, built on arrogance and intimidation, started to crumble. Lucia took no pleasure in his downfall. She did not give interviews about him. She did not speak his name in public. When reporters asked about that night, she simply said, "I played the piano. That is all that matters." She had more important things to focus on. Adrian had kept his word. He walked away from his father's money without looking back. He rented a small apartment in the city, got a job at a non-profit organization, and started building a life that was truly his own. It was not easy. There were days when he missed the comfort he had grown up with, but every time he looked at Lucia, he knew he had made the right choice. They spent those 6 months together, learning each other's stories, healing old wounds, discovering what it meant to be truly seen by another person. Lucia began playing the piano again, not for audiences, but for herself. She would sit at a rented keyboard in Adrian's tiny apartment and play for hours, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying, always feeling more alive than she had in years. And then the invitation came. It arrived in a simple white envelope, addressed to Lucia Delgado. Inside was a letter from one of the most famous concert halls in the world. They wanted her to perform a full solo concert, dedicated to the memory of her father. Lucia read the letter 3 times before she believed it was real. Adrian found her sitting on the couch, the letter trembling in her hands. When she told him what it said, he wrapped his arms around her and held her while she cried. These were not tears of sadness. They were tears of something she had almost forgotten existed: joy. The next few months were a blur of preparation. Lucia practiced for hours every day. She worked with coaches and trainers. She selected the pieces she would perform, choosing music that meant the most to her and her father. She pushed herself harder than she ever had before. There were moments of doubt, late nights when she wondered if she was ready, early mornings when the fear crept in and whispered that she would fail. But every time she felt like giving up, she remembered her father's voice. "The music will find its way back to you," he used to say. "Trust it." So she trusted it. The night of the concert arrived. The hall was sold out. Over 2,000 people filled the seats, dressed in their finest clothes. Buzzing with anticipation, cameras from news stations around the world were set up to broadcast the performance live. Everyone wanted to see the woman who had captured the world's attention with a single video. Backstage, Lucia stood alone in her dressing room. She wore a simple black gown, elegant but understated. Her hair was pulled back, and around her neck hung a small gold locket. Inside the locket was a photograph of her father, taken on the day of her first recital when she was 7 years old. She touched the locket gently and closed her eyes. "I am here, Papa," she whispered. "I made it back." A knock on the door. Adrian entered, looking handsome in a suit he had bought with his own money. He walked over and took her hands in his. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Terrified," she admitted. "And excited. And grateful. And about 100 other things I cannot name." He smiled. "You are going to be incredible. I know it." She looked into his eyes. This man who had given up everything to stand beside her. She still could not quite believe he was real. "Thank you," she said, "for believing in me when I had forgotten how to believe in myself." He kissed her forehead softly. "Always." A stagehand appeared at the door. "Miss Delgado?" "It is time." Lucia took a deep breath. She squeezed Adrian's hand one last time. Then she turned and walked toward the stage. The lights were blinding at first. The applause was deafening. 2,000 people rose to their feet before she had even played a single note, welcoming her back to the world she had left behind so long ago. She walked to the piano, a magnificent Steinway that gleamed under the spotlights. She sat down on the bench, adjusted her gown, and placed her fingers on the keys. The hall fell silent. She thought of her father. She thought of the tiny apartment in Buenos Aires, where he had taught her to play. She thought of all the years of pain and silence, and all the moments of beauty that had led her here. Then she began to play. The music poured out of her like water from a spring. It filled the hall, rose to the ceiling, wrapped around every person in the audience like an embrace. She played pieces by Chopin, Beethoven, and Debussy. She played a composition her father had written just for her, a piece she had not performed since she was 19 years old, and she played with everything she had. The audience was mesmerized. Some wept openly. Others sat frozen, afraid to move, afraid to break the spell. When she finished the final piece, her hands hovering above the keys in the silence that followed, no one breathed. Then the hall erupted. The standing ovation lasted nearly 10 minutes. People cheered, clapped, shouted her name. Flowers rained down onto the stage. Lucia stood and bowed, tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by the love pouring toward her from every direction. She looked out into the audience and found Adrian in the front row. He was on his feet like everyone else, clapping so hard his hands must have hurt. But what she noticed most was the look on his face: pride, love, and something that looked like wonder. She smiled at him through her tears. Later that night, after the interviews and the photographs and the endless congratulations, they walked together along the quiet city streets. The air was cool, and the stars were bright overhead. "Your father would have been so proud," Adrian said. Lucia looked up at the sky. "I think he was there tonight. I felt him, in the music, in the applause, in every note." She stopped walking and turned to face Adrian. "You know," she said, "your father made that ridiculous bet as a joke. He never imagined I would actually play. And he certainly never imagined you would be standing here with me now." Adrian laughed softly. "I guess the joke is on him." Lucia shook her head. "No. The joke was never the point. The point is that I found my way back to my music. And I found you. And I found myself again." She took his hand and held it tightly. "I spent 12 years hiding from the world," she said. "I thought I had lost everything. But it turns out, I was just waiting for the right moment to come back. I think my—" Adrian pulled her close. "And now?" She smiled, a real smile, full of peace and hope and everything she had been afraid to feel for so long. "Now," she said, "I am finally home." They walked on together into the night, leaving the past behind and stepping into a future neither of them could have imagined. But that is how the best stories go, is it not? Sometimes the people the world overlooks are the ones with the most extraordinary gifts. Sometimes the cruelest moments lead to the most beautiful beginnings. And sometimes, if you are brave enough to keep going, the music finds its way back to you. It always does.